Hi everyone, sorry about the technical difficulties there. Hopefully you can all hear and see me now. I'm Brian, welcome to our Magoosh webinar on how to get started studying for the GRE. So today we're going to be covering a handful of things. But first, allow me to introduce myself a little more. I've been here with Magoosh for 3 years now. I am primarily a GRE tutor and expert, so I have worked with lots of students on hitting their target scores here. As you're getting started learning about the GRE here, I encourage you to think about the GRE sort of more like a game that you need to learn the rules and strategies for. Then you really need to think about it as a knowledge test. It's really a logic and reasoning test more than anything. A couple other things before we get into any content here. Please say hello to Davy. She's monitoring our chat here today, so any questions you have that pop up, feel free to drop them in the chat and she will get those over to me. Ideally, we will be able to cover most of your questions here today live. Anything we don't get to, we will follow up with. I'll talk about that more in a second too. Last thing I just want to address here is there will be no visuals on my end here today, so there were a bunch of links put into our chat here or into the description of this stream. So I'll be calling those links out as we go through them together. Those links will also be sent to you in the follow-up email here as well. Okay, so for our agenda today, we will be doing some housekeeping first just to cover some logistics. Then we'll get into determining your target score. Then we'll cover creating a study plan. Then we'll cover practice tests. And then lastly, we'll have a Q&A here to clear up any questions that weren't addressed at the end. On the housekeeping side, we will be sending you a recording of this at the end in a follow-up email. So if you missed anything, or don't worry about taking notes too diligently, you'll be able to come back and review what we covered. Again, there will be a Q&A at the end to cover any dire questions that you need answered. And if we don't get to your question, or if you're watching this as a recording, you weren't able to attend live, feel free to send any of your questions over to help@magoosh.com. We're happy to follow up. And any questions that you do leave in the chat for us today that we don't get to, we're going to be answering and sending you in the follow-up email as well. Okay, so let's jump into determining your target score then. So first, let's talk about the GRE target scoring ranges here. So the GRE range for the overall test ranges from 260 to 340 as a combined score. That means for the verbal section, you can score from 130 to 170, and for the math section, you can score from 130 to 170. There is also the writing portion of the exam. The score there is 0 to 6. We're not going to spend much time talking about the writing here today. It's just not as important of an element of the test to most programs as the math and writing scores will be. Let's talk about average scores here. So the average score on the GRE is a 304 combined. That's a 150 on the verbal, which is roughly the 46th percentile, and a 154 on the math. That's the 53rd percentile. We might be thinking that the average score should be 300, right in the middle of 260 and 340. But the average is based, again, on percentiles, how people have scored compared to the percentage of other test takers who have taken the test. And so in this case, because people tend to be a little bit better on the math side of things, it skews the overall average score to a combined 304. As you're thinking and learning about picking your target scores, here are the key elements you need to be focused on. Target scores should be completely program dependent. You may have in your head that, oh, 160, 160 sounds great on paper. And it is a fantastic score if you're able to achieve that. But most people don't need to achieve 160, 160 for the program they'll be applying to. If you're applying to a humanities-based program, it's much more likely that the programs are going to be concerned with your verbal score than with your math score. Conversely, if you're applying to a STEM program or an MBA business program, it's likely that the programs will be a little bit more concerned with your math score. The number one thing you should be doing as you determine your target score is checking with the programs you plan on applying to figure out what are the average scores for the incoming class for those programs. Your goal in setting your target score should be to get right in the ballpark of those averages. You could be a plus or minus. If we think about what an average means, For every person who was 5 points above that average score, they likely took someone who was also 5 points below that average score. So don't worry about hitting exactly on that number. Ideally, you could beat those numbers. But again, the number one goal in setting your target score is to figure out simply what were the averages of the programs I'm applying to and hitting those numbers. We can take a look here at the first link. Just very briefly, this link says, what is a good GRE score? So again, to get some more information about your averages and what kind of scores go along with certain types of programs, this is a free resource available on our blog, and it's filled with useful information that will help you in determining, again, where you want your target score to be, how you can think about percentiles, etc. We won't spend too much time on this link, so if you actually want to jump to the next one, GRE scores by major. So this might be a little more helpful as you're trying to set your target score here. We can see the averages on this if we just look at the first chart on social science for various programs. Again, if we look at something like psychology, which is a little bit down the chart, the average verbal score is 152, the average math score is 149. Average scores tend to be a little lower maybe than we think as we're jumping into GRE study. That's why it's important to do this kind of research and figure out what are the average scores for the programs I'm applying to, so that we don't set the bar too high or waste too much time studying on the GRE at the expense of other elements of our application. So targeting your score to the programs you're applying to really is key. If you are looking to beat the average because you're applying to top tier schools, Ivy League schools, the next blog post here covers average scores for top university programs. The first school covered, naturally, will be Harvard. A couple things to point out if we look at this link here. So first, if we look at the average scores for people applying to computer science at Harvard, we'll notice that the quant score, the math score, is pretty high, 161 to 165 is the average range. However, the verbal score is 155 to 159. That's a little over the average verbal score for all test takers. Again, the message here is that just because you're applying to the top tier programs doesn't mean you need to have a near perfect score on your GRE. It really is program dependent what your scores need to look like. Similarly, if we scroll down to psychology on this chart, we'll notice this time it's reversed. The psychology verbal scores, the average at Harvard, are 161 to 165. However, the math scores are only an average of 155 to 159. If we think back to the average overall math score, the average overall math score in the GRE is a 154. That means the average score for psych majors at Harvard is only a point above this. So again, it takes a little time to do this research, but it's really worth investing in figuring out what is the specific score you need as you are figuring out what your target range will be for the programs you're applying to. Davey, do we have any questions here? Yes, for questions that we have related to target scores. So there's growing concern that U.S. schools won't be taking the GRE anymore. Is that true? So this is a pretty complex issue. It's something we're aware of here at Magoosh and trying to plan for to help our students best as well. At the moment, it's unclear how programs will be viewing the GRE. Right now, few programs have moved away from it. Most still are taking the GRE. I think even as schools tend to move away from the GRE, for the time being, many fellowships and funding are still tied to GRE scores. So even if you don't necessarily need it as an element of your application, there's still benefit to having a good GRE score or having a GRE score on record. So this is, again, where you don't want to overly invest time as you're preparing for the GRE at the expense of other elements of your application. But for the time being, you probably will need a GRE score. But it definitely is the case that programs are starting to put less weight on that score and more interest in your resume, your life experiences, your work history, your references. If all of those elements of your application are strong, it definitely weighs heavily compared to just a GRE score. Any other questions on target scores, David? All right then. So the next thing we have to discuss here will be creating a study plan. So first, if you join with Magoosh here, we have study plans that we can offer you that will cover any framework or duration of study. So our study plans are available for free on our blog. So if you need help sort of planning and charting your study, we'll jump into how you can think about our study plans here in a second. Steps to choosing and or creating a study plan. So the first thing you need to do is identify your timeline. How long are you going to be studying for the GRE? How much time do you have as a daily commitment to be studying for the GRE? The next step is to take a practice test so that you can identify strengths and weaknesses. We'll talk a little bit more about this in our next segment here. And then lastly, the last thing you will do is acquire study materials. And I want to emphasize that your study material acquisition should be the last step after you have sort of plotted out your target scores, identified your timeline, and taken a practice test. The reason for this is simply that when we're starting to practice, we may just have in mind that, oh, I'm going to acquire every resource available because I'm going to spend all this time and money preparing for the GRE. But after we take the practice test, we might realize, oh, we're very close to our target score and we don't need to spend as much time and money as we initially thought. I would encourage you to figure out where you currently stand in your target, where you currently stand compared to your target score before you start spending money left and right to acquire study materials, because you may or may not need as much time and effort and money spent as you may think as you're jumping in. We'll cover our study materials. Let's jump over to our blog here then. So the next thing we could take a look at is, we'll skip that percentile link. We'll go to the link entitled 6 Things You Can Do to Get a Good GRE Score. So these will obviously be the keys to how we think about creating our study plan here. So the more time we give ourselves and the more we prepare over a longer period of time, the better off we'll be going forward. Like step 2 says, take practice tests early and often. The more you are measuring yourself, the more accurate your prediction will be for how you're going to perform on test day. Develop a good test-taking strategy for you. So again, following along with our study schedules will be very helpful, but sometimes we have specific needs that maybe aren't covered by a specific study schedule. Reach out to us here at Magoosh. You can just send a quick email to help@magoosh.com. For all of our premium members, we are happy to offer support to help you really target and nail down a study strategy that will be best suited to you. Step 4 here, take care of yourself. We'll spend a minute talking about this. Living in the US and living globally is kind of crazy right now. Between COVID, between fights for equality and fights against racism, it's just very mentally taxing for a lot of people. And taking care of your mental health is a really important part of your test preparation here. So sometimes that may mean taking a little extra time off, or just saying, I need to take a break and step away from my study right now because there are other things that are more important, or that I need to reevaluate my plans and my deadlines and my timelines here. Don't let the GRE become an extra stress factor in your life. Things are very hard for a lot of people across the globe right now. And it really is important to just step back for a minute and really focus on your own self-care and self-health and make sure you're taking care of yourselves. Lastly, be prepared to take the test multiple times. This is not an exciting recommendation for a lot of people, but it's important to just have in mind that we may need to take the test more than once. Test takers who do take the test multiple times, they tend to perform better the second time. The first time, there's test anxiety, there's awkwardness of being in the test center, or there's the awkwardness of right now taking the test at home for yourself. So definitely, in terms of your timeline, it's always good to give yourself that safety fallback test date. If you nail it the first time, you don't have to worry about it. But it is going to be helpful to just have that fail-safe date so that if you feel you underperformed the first time, you at least built into your study schedule a timeline so that you have the opportunity to take the test again. Coming back to our links here, the next thing we could do here before we jump into the specific study schedules is we can quickly take a look at this ultimate guide to the GRE. So if you're coming to the GRE for the first time here, you've never really read or learned anything about the GRE. This maybe in learning about applying to your programs was the first time you've ever heard the GRE mentioned. This is a great resource for you. This will walk you through everything you need to know about the GRE here. So I would start obviously by just reading the introduction to familiarize yourself with the test, what it's measuring, how it operates. Reading the second bullet point here, studying. There's lots of resources again for study plans. We'll get into that in just a second. And then number 3, reading about the test format. So before you take a practice test, you should read about the test format just so you're familiar with what you're going to be encountering. Let's go ahead and jump over to this study schedule archives now. So this is our general study schedules link here. If you see on our top crawl bar, there's the study schedules on our blog. And if you click that, that would bring you to this web page here. If you scroll over that drop-down menu on top of our blog here, it'll show you all sorts of study schedules of different lengths. There's a 1 week, there's a 1 month, daily. There's the 90-day beginner, 90-day advanced, math focused, verbal focused, etc. Again, your timeline is going to determine which of these study plans you're going to go with. Ideally, following along with our 90-day beginner plan is the place that most students should be starting. Giving yourself 3 months to prepare for the exam is generally the right timeline here. You may be wondering what the difference between our beginner plan and our advanced plan is. We'll cover that here briefly. The nomenclature there may be a little misleading. Beginner really means that you've never prepared or studied for the GRE before. So the idea here is not that it's for people with rudimentary skills. It's really for people that just have never prepared for the GRE in any way before. It is comprehensive. It will cover everything that you will come across when you are studying in the Magoosh Premium product. So it will cover all of our lesson videos, all our practice tests. It also incorporates additional outside resources as well. So definitely it's on our blog for free. So anyone using Magoosh or anyone who's not signed up with Magoosh could still access these study plans. But they are tailored for people who have signed up for our premium product as well. The 90-day advanced study plan, you can think of maybe more as a retest study plan. So people who have used Magoosh before, people who have prepared for the GRE before, those are the people who might find our advanced plan a little more helpful. It will be a little bit more targeted in the lesson videos that it recommends, and it will be a little bit more practice question heavy as opposed to lesson heavy. So I recommend that most of you, if you're here today because you're just starting your GRE journey, that you try to budget your time so that you could start with the 90-day study plan. But we'll talk about what you could do if maybe you don't have 90 days here. So the next link says adapting the GRE study schedule. And the key point of this blog post here is that you should always aim for the shorter study schedule because it's easier to add to a study schedule than it is to subtract from a study schedule. So if you have 2 months to study, it might be better and it's preferable that you would follow along with the 1 month study plan, and then you would have the ability to add additional study and additional resources to that study plan, as opposed to starting with the 3 month plan and trying to trim it down to fit into a 2 month window. When you trim it down, you never know if you're cutting things that would have been important to your study. But when you start with the smaller study plan, it's always easy to add more and more and more. One other question to cover here quickly about study plans. So most of our study plans expect you to be studying about 2 to 4 hours a day. That's obviously going to be dependent on your availability, your resourcing, how quickly you're able to get through practice sessions, how quickly you're able to review your practice sessions, etc. But I think the ideal mark is for 6 days a week, you're going to be still putting in somewhere roughly between 2 and 4 hours a day. Our study plans do incorporate built-in rest days. They incorporate when you should be taking a practice test. So all that's in there. It does also give you sort of rough time estimates for how long each day should be taking you to study as well. Okay, I've got a couple questions here on study plans, so we'll jump into these. First up, how do I maintain consistency in the study plan? This is a great question. It's definitely a challenging issue as well. So I think the first thing is just coming up with a system to hold yourself accountable. Whether that's making your own separate calendar, whether that's having a friend or a family member, or maybe just sort of stay on top of you to make sure that you're doing your daily requirements. If you're part of Magoosh and you have signed up for a premium program, it's possible that you can load a study plan into your dashboard and it will sort of give you reminders and check marks and tasks for these are the things you should be doing every day. In terms of holding yourself accountable, I think it's, again, and I spoke about this during the self-care thing, it's also important to remember that sometimes you do just need a little break and a little time off, and that is okay too. That what you want to focus on sometimes is not doing everything every day, but just saying to yourself, have I done something to take a positive step forward for the GRE? It's very easy as we're taking a step away to say, I can't do it all today, so I'm not going to do anything. And we may have that thought for 2-3 days in a row, and all of a sudden we look up and an entire week has passed by and we haven't done anything. If we take small steps, maybe all we could do today was watch a couple lesson videos. Maybe all we were able to do was a small practice set. The idea here is that we want to just make sure that even when we can't do it all, that we're just taking small steps toward our goal. Another study question here. How do you implement vocab in your study plan? Good. So this is a important question. Obviously, building vocabulary is one of the longest, most challenging parts of GRE study here. So vocabulary is sort of just mentioned as a overall conceptual thing in our study plans. Your goal should be to be working regularly on vocabulary. Personally, I think a good target goal is to be aiming to learn 10 new vocab words every day. Depending on how strong your memory is, you may be able to go up to 20 words. You might be struggling to learn 10 new words a day, and you might have to go down to only 5 new words a day. We have free flashcards available on our Magoosh blog. It's an app you can download for Android or Apple. You can also access them on your desktop or laptop. I would encourage everyone to go ahead and download that app. There's over 1,000 words you can learn that are helpful for the GRE. I think having that app and just saying, I'm going to flip through this, when commercials are on during TV, or when I'm taking the subway or the bus somewhere, although maybe a lot of us can't be doing that at the moment still due to quarantine. But whenever you have that small opportunity where you can just say, I can pull this app out and I can do a little vocab work, I think that's a good way to take advantage of all mobile resources you have for your study. Another question here, how do I study for only 1 month? So we do have the 1 month study plan on the blog there as well. That will give you a pretty rough guideline for how you can go about studying. What I would say is this. When you're studying for a month, you're obviously going to be oppressed a little bit more for time. And if you're trying to do that on top of a full-time job, you maybe don't have a lot of time on weekdays or weeknights to be studying as well. I think when you have only the 1 month timeline, it's really important, going back to the target scores, to identify what your target scores needs are and which section of the exam is going to be more important. And you're going to want to be focused a little bit more heavily toward that section as opposed to the less important section. But it's still totally possible to show a nice improvement over the 1 month period. But it really, again, is going to come down to more how much time you have to put in on a daily basis, and then how quickly you're able to learn from mistakes you've made and implement those learnings into your study going forward. Any other study questions here, Davey? All right, then, let's go ahead and we can, I guess the last thing, just to reiterate here, if you're having trouble figuring out which study plan does fit your needs, or you need help sort of game planning for more specific needs, reach out to us at help@magoosh.com. We're happy to provide guidance to our students to really figure out how to tailor a study plan to suit their needs. So again, just reach out to us at help@magoosh.com with your study plan questions. Last thing to talk about here is practice tests. So practice tests are the best way to gauge your progress. You should be planning on taking multiple practice tests. You can take multiple practice tests through Magoosh. There's also a free diagnostic exam available to you on Magoosh as well. So that is the next link in our window there, free practice tests with answers and explanations. So again, I would read through on our ultimate guide, sort of the test format, just so you can familiarize yourself with what the test is going to look like when you get into your practice exam here. But you can then use this free diagnostic, and this is available to everyone. It's free on our blog. You don't need to sign up with us to access this. This is not a full-length exam. It is only a segment of an exam. But this will help you in diagnosing your strengths and weaknesses, which portion of the exam you may be better at, etc. If you need help sort of analyzing anything from this, feel free again to reach out to us at help@magoosh.com. We're always happy to help give you a little guidance. If you reach out to us during business hours on the East Coast, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. or 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. on the West Coast, we also have live chat support. That is only for our premium students. But they are also, again, happy to help give you some guidance as to how to interpret your results here and how you can move forward in planning for your study. Again, I encourage everyone to take a diagnostic. Ideally, you could take a full-length practice exam at the start of your study. It's really important to take the practice exam so that you can learn specifically where your strengths and weaknesses lie and the level of effort you're going to need to put into your study going forward. Again, once you've set your target score, the practice test may show that you're only a couple points away from that target score, and you really don't need to spend as much time or effort as you had initially thought you would in preparing for the exam. Conversely, you may find out that you're much further away from your target score than you had thought you would be. And if that's the case, you may have to rethink how you're going to go about studying, how much time and effort you're going to be putting into studying, etc. But again, using a practice test is the best way to sort of gauge that level of effort. And then going forward in your study, using a study guide is using a practice exam is the best way to just measure your progress over time. You're going to want to take regular practice exams. Leading up to your exam, you probably want to take 3 practice exams the 3 consecutive weeks before your exam. And you're going to use your practice results to really track, am I able to hit my target score? Have I reached my target score? Am I exceeding my target score? When you can consistently hit your target number on practice exams, then you'll know that you're really ready to take the full-length exam for real. Practice test questions here, David. So, is it necessary to start with a mock test? So, it's not 100% necessary, but I really, really recommend it as something that you should strongly consider doing. Again, the number one thing we need to consider here is how close or far away we are from our target score. We simply won't know that until we've taken a practice exam. So by taking that practice exam, it really, again, just allows you to highlight, these are my strengths on this exam. These are my weaknesses on the exam. This is what I need to do and focus on going forward to hit my target score. Or again, I'm already at my target score and I don't need to put in as much time and effort. So while there are ways around it where you could start with the study guide and do a couple of weeks of studying before you jump into a practice exam, I really think ideally you should be focused on getting to the practice exam first. All right, next question. What if I study only practice tests for Quant and Verbal? Do I need lessons or other practice? So this will come down to, being evaluated on a person-by-person basis. If you're only aiming for an average score and you have pretty strong natural test-taking abilities, it's quite possible that just taking practice exams will give you enough practice and knowledge to take the real exam. A lot of people, though, probably won't fall into that bucket, and depending on what you studied in your undergraduate, you maybe studied humanities, in which case you probably didn't look at any math for 4 years in your undergrad. Now all of a sudden, half of the exam you have to take is math. And while it is all math that you learned once upon a time in high school, it may be just topics that we have not thought about in a long time. And you probably will need some lesson videos or lesson content from books or whatever resources you're using to get back up to speed, and vice versa. If we studied a math major in college, we maybe didn't spend as much time on things like reading and vocabulary, and we're going to need to spend a little time getting those skills up to speed as well. Apart from ETS, which practice tests are more closer to GRE? Great question. So I think the Magoosh practice tests do very well in mimicking the GRE here. There are other practice tests out there from Manhattan Prep, Barron's, Kaplan, McGraw-Hill. There are lots of practice tests out there. I think one thing that sets the Magoosh practice tests apart, even from the ETS tests, is on the GRE, we're given 2 math sections, 2 verbal sections, and then we have a 5th experimental section that could be math or verbal. When you do the ETS practice exams, or when you do practice exams with other companies, they exclude that experimental section. And while that experimental section doesn't count to your score, it very much counts toward the endurance and mental fatigue that you are required to put in while you're taking the exam. The Magoosh practice tests do include that 5th experimental section. And so as you're training to build your stamina, as you're training to take a section that you really don't know, is this going to count? Is this not going to count? I think it's very beneficial to have that extra experimental section there. There are questions on practice tests. Okay, so how many full practice tests does Magoosh provide in premium? This is a great question. So it's a little tricky to answer. There is one test that is of questions that are exclusively set aside for practice exam purposes. Beyond that, you can theoretically take an infinite number of practice tests with Magoosh. So the way a Magoosh practice test is created is it pulls unanswered questions from your general question bank, question pool in the Magoosh product. So in theory, if going back to the earlier question about can I only take practice exams, you could use Magoosh to exclusively take practice exams, and you would get a bunch of practice exams out of it. Depending on how you want to use your study, do I want to be focused on doing smaller practice sets versus just doing practice exams? As long as you have unanswered questions in your Magoosh question bank pool, you will keep seeing new practice tests that are randomly generated from Magoosh. Other practice test questions. Great, so again, if you take the diagnostic with us, if you take a full-length exam through Magoosh and you sign up, if you have questions, if you need help sort of figuring out where do I go from here, what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, reach out to us through our chat or through our email support at help@magoosh.com. If you are a premium member, you can just click that little purple help button down in the bottom of the screen, and that'll get you connected with our help team as well. All right, so that concludes our presentation here. I know we went a little long, but we still have some more questions, so it's Q&A time. First question up here. On the real test, does the difficulty of the math part go up? Or did the difficulty of the math go up over time, I guess? I heard that from people I know. So I hear a lot of students bring this up as well. In short, the answer to this should be no. There's no actual evidence that this has been happening. What maybe has happened over time that affects scores is the curve, and thus the percentiles, has become a little steeper on the math portion of the exam. So if you look at percentile charts available from the exam, so if you look at percentile charts available from ETS, you'll notice that a perfect score on the verbal section is the 99th percentile, whereas a perfect score on the math section is only the 96th percentile. That means that 4% of math test takers are posting a perfect score. Because of this, the curve is just skewed and it's a little less forgiving. So mistakes sort of cost you more points on the math section than they would on the verbal section. And so it may appear that the test is harder because it's scored a little more challenging than the verbal. But in terms of the actual difficulty, the actual concepts and questions that appear on the test, there's no difference since they switched over to this format. Next question, how far in advance should I sign up for the test? So this is a great question. It's a little tricky. It first depends, the number one thing you should be considering in signing and picking up a test date is when you need your scores to be submitted by. So ETS takes maybe 10 to 14 business days to get score reports processed and sent. So you definitely want to be leaving yourself 2 to 3 weeks before your applications are due. And I think 3 weeks is probably the safe measuring stick to make sure your test scores get in. As to when you should be scheduling it, ideally you want to use your practice scores to sort of guide you to when you should schedule a test. Again, if you can consistently hit around your target score, you may want to say, okay, 2 weeks from now, I feel I'm ready to take the exam. But the number one consideration should really be how you feel in your practice, what's going right in your practice, what's going wrong in your practice, where you are in relation to your target score. But the other consideration, again, is just simply when we need the test taken by. Sure, so next question here, any quant tips? So the quant I find to be a little easier than the verbal. The reason for this being that on the verbal, we sometimes can just get a section where there's lots of vocabulary words we don't recognize, even if we've learned hundreds and hundreds of vocabulary words. The math is a little bit more systematic in that way, where we can sort of learn what to expect here. The number one thing, though, to focus on for the quant, we have on our blog a frequency chart for topics that appear on the math. If you go to the Magoosh blog and you type in quant frequency, it should bring you to that blog post. Focus on the heavy topics, the heavily tested topics. So the big topics are going to be word problems, algebra, percents, ratios, fractions, geometry. If you're familiar with the GRE, there's data interpretation, which is analyzing charts and graphs. Invest in learning the heavily tested topics first. The next thing that I recommend for everyone is to really focus on how to take the test strategically as opposed to mathematically. I know it feels like you're taking a math test, but going back to my earlier comments, you should really be thinking about this as a game and thinking about how you can use strategies to shortcut the questions. The two main strategies you'll want to be practicing are going to be plugging in numbers and back solving. Just quickly to explain what those are. Plugging in numbers is whenever we see variables in the answer choices, we can substitute numbers in for those variables. And back solving is whenever we see all numbers in the answer choices, we can work backward from those numbers to test the answer choices. These are concepts that are covered in Magoosh Premium lessons. We will be developing more content around these strategies as well going forward, but definitely invest in thinking about how to take the test strategically for the quant. Other questions? All right, next one. If I'm to write the GRE fall next year, which study plan would be best for me if I start now? So if we're aiming for the fall, it depends a little on what we mean by fall. If we mean early fall, like September, or late fall, like November. But I think ideally, if you're just starting now, the first place, again, to start is the 3-month beginner study plan. And that's sort of thinking that we'll be taking it in early fall. That gets us through June, July, and August. That leaves us a little time in September to take it in early fall. The benefit of taking it in early fall with that timeline is, again, if we don't hit our score on that first test in September, we will still have a little time in October to take the test again. And remember, we can always add to that study plan as opposed to starting with the 6-month and subtracting. All right, guys, we're almost out of time, but we will be emailing out answers to all the questions we didn't get to. Do we have one more we could squeeze in here before we let everyone go for the day? All right, last question for the night, guys. About online tests, can I have a white paper to take notes or calculations? So for the at-home test, you can read about this on the ETS website. You can also read about it on the Magoosh blog. If you go to our blog and you search for COVID, it will cover all the information you need to know about the online test. But the shorter answer to this is no, you cannot use paper. You have the ability to use either a small erasable whiteboard, an 8x12 whiteboard with an erasable marker, or you can use a translucent sleeve of paper that you would slide the piece of white paper in. But again, the translucent sheet is erasable. This is for security measures. You're not allowed to remove questions or share questions from your test with other people. And so when you take the at-home exam, the proctor needs to be able to see that you have erased the notes that you were taking and that you didn't remove any materials from the test center, which obviously is your house in this situation. Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us here tonight. Again, I realize there's probably a lot of questions we didn't get to. We will be following up with those answers within the next 24 hours for everyone. So keep a lookout for the follow-up email here. We'll also be emailing out the link to this video. So if there's anything you want to go back and follow up on, you should be able to do that too. Thank you all for the tremendous turnout. It's great to see so many people show up. It's great to see the chat so active. I hope you all enjoyed this, and I wish you the best of luck as you go forward with your studies. And again, if there's anything Magoosh can do to assist you along the way, please reach out to us. Have a great day, everyone.